There is a honey-stone manor house in Somerset called Mells Manor. It has been in the same family since the 1540s. The family's name is Horner. Local records and centuries of popular tradition say a man named Horner once pulled a deed to that very estate out of a pie, a literal pastry, sent as a bribe to a king who was busy dismantling the English church. Children still sing about it. Little Jack Horner sat in a corner eating a Christmas pie. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "What a good boy am I." The plum was not a fruit. It was stolen land. And the man who originally owned that land, an abbot reportedly around 80 years old named Richard Whiting, was dragged through the streets of Glastonbury, hauled to the summit of the Tor, and hanged, drawn and quartered for the crime of failing to surrender monastic wealth fast enough. His head was nailed to the abbey gate. A nursery rhyme turned the theft of a murdered man's estate into a cheerful verse about a boy eating dessert. That is one rhyme. There are more. And every single one of them is worse than you were told. The story of English nursery rhymes is not really a story about children's songs. It is a story about the English crown, an institution that, across 5 centuries, generated enough persecution, greed, conspiracy, civil war, and political murder that ordinary people had to encode what they witnessed inside verses too silly for anyone in power to take seriously. The rhymes survived because they sounded like nonsense. The history they carry is not nonsense at all. And the strange part, the part that should unsettle you, is that the places where these events happened are still standing. You can walk through them, you can touch the walls, you can buy a picture book of the songs in the gift shop without anyone mentioning the blood. To understand how a nursery rhyme can carry the weight of an old man's execution, you have to understand the scale of what Henry VIII did between 1536 and 1541. He dissolved more than 800 monasteries across England. Royal commissioners arrived at each one, inventoried the property down to the silver candlesticks, expelled the monks and nuns, stripped the lead from the roofs, and auctioned the furnishings. The seized monastic lands generated an estimated £136,000 in annual income, a figure that, in terms of economic power, represents billions in modern equivalents. It was the largest single redistribution of property in English history before or since, and it was conducted not through chaotic looting, but through paperwork. Receipts were filed, inventories were checked, land was parcelled to loyal supporters with documented grants. The entire operation ran like a government department, because that is exactly what it was. Commissioners recorded what they found in each house, the weight of the plate, the value of the vestments, the number of monks or nuns, the livestock on the land. The machinery of destruction was thorough enough to produce its own archive. Glastonbury Abbey was among the richest targets on the list. It was, by some reckonings, the second wealthiest monastery in England, rivalled only by Westminster Abbey. Its annual income was reported to exceed even that of the king himself. Richard Whiting had served as its abbot since 1525, a man reportedly in his 80s by the time the king's agents arrived. He had governed the abbey quietly and effectively for over a decade before the political ground shifted beneath him. By January 1539, Glastonbury was the only monastery left standing in the whole of Somerset. According to the traditional account, Whiting attempted to save 12 manorial estates by hiding the title deeds inside a pie and sending the package to the king as a peace offering. A steward named Horner, Jack in the rhyme, though the documented purchaser of the estate was a Thomas Horner, was entrusted with the delivery. What happened next depends on whom you believe. The popular version, the one that became the rhyme, says Horner opened the pie during the journey, found the deed to the manor of Mells, and quietly kept it for himself. The Horner family denied this for centuries. They insisted the land was purchased legitimately, and the original title deed bearing the king's seal reportedly survives in the family's possession to this day. But the property records confirm the family's acquisition of Mells during the dissolution period. The denial survived. So did the manor, and so did the rhyme. Whiting, stripped of anything left to bargain with, was arrested on charges so thin that Thomas Cromwell's own preparatory notes reportedly included a memorandum ordering the abbot to be tried and also executed. The outcome written down before the trial had taken place. The commissioners who arrived at Glastonbury in September 1539 expected to find hidden treasure. They searched vaults and outbuildings and accused Whiting of concealing valuables that belonged, by the logic of the new order, to the crown. The old abbot was sent to the Tower of London for interrogation. No record of that interrogation survives. In November 1539, he was transported back to Somerset. Subjected to what multiple sources describe as a mock trial at Wells, and then dragged on a hurdle through the streets of Glastonbury to the top of the Tor, a hilltop visible for miles across the Somerset levels. He was executed alongside two of his monks, John Thorne and Roger James. His head was fixed above the gate of his own ruined abbey. The 4 quarters of his body were displayed in 4 towns across Somerset as a warning. Today, tourists climb the Tor for the panoramic view. There is no prominent memorial at the summit explaining what happened to an elderly man on that spot. The nursery rhyme is the closest thing to a public record most people will ever encounter. The Horner family tomb still sits inside the church at Mells. The manor still stands. The children still sing. And the plum was never a plum. Within a generation of the dissolution, the wealth Henry had seized was largely spent. The king, who pulled more property out of the English church than any monarch before him, left a treasury that could not sustain his military ambitions. The plum that Jack Horner pulled from the pie outlasted the king's own share. But Henry did not only steal from the church, he cracked open a religious fault line that would bleed through the next century of English history. He broke with Rome to annul a marriage. He created a Protestant England that his own daughter would spend her entire reign trying to destroy. And that daughter generated a nursery rhyme of her own. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockleshells and pretty maids all in a row. The popular interpretation, widely repeated but first appearing long after Mary's actual reign, connects the garden to graveyards, the silver bells and cockleshells to instruments of torture or execution devices, and the pretty maids all in a row to either graves or a guillotine-like device called the maiden. Scholars have cautioned that the connection between this specific rhyme and this specific queen cannot be treated as established historical fact. But the history it has been mapped onto requires no embellishment whatsoever. Mary I ascended the throne in 1553, the first woman to rule England in her own right. She immediately began reversing the Reformation her father had started. Between 1555 and her death in 1558, her regime burned approximately 280 Protestants at the stake. These were not spontaneous acts of mob violence. They were administratively organized executions. Local sheriffs arranged the fuel. Officials selected the sites. Spectators were expected to attend as a public demonstration of royal and religious authority. The victims were not only prominent churchmen. Tradesmen were burned. Married couples were burned. Women were burned, at least 56 of them. The campaign reached into ordinary communities across southern England, touching people who had no political power and no public platform, only a faith that the regime had decided was criminal. Smithfield in London served as a primary execution ground, a location now occupied by a famous meat market and a busy modern neighbourhood where office workers pass through every morning without encountering a single prominent memorial to what happened on the same ground. The buildings have changed. The street layout has shifted, but the name remains. And beneath the routine of a modern commute, the geography of persecution is still intact. The scale earned Mary the name that still follows her across 5 centuries: Bloody Mary. But the woman behind the campaign was more complicated than the label suggests. She genuinely believed she was saving immortal souls by burning mortal bodies. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was meant to produce a Catholic heir who would secure the religious settlement permanently and bind England to the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe. The marriage produced nothing. Mary experienced at least 2 false pregnancies, publicly announced, widely anticipated, diplomatically significant, and medically humiliating. She burned nearly 300 people to preserve a religious order that her own body could not perpetuate through succession. She died in November 1558, childless, and the crown passed to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. The fires at Smithfield went out. The rhyme about the garden did not. 3 of those Protestants burned under Mary's regime may have their own nursery rhyme, and, if the popular interpretation is correct, it is one of the most casually cruel transformations in the history of children's literature. 3 blind mice. 3 blind mice. See how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife, who cut off their tails with a carving knife. Did you ever see such a sight in your life as 3 blind mice? The rhyme was first published in 1609, decades after the burnings, and the connection is interpretive rather than definitively proven. But the 3 figures most frequently linked to it are Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, Bishop Hugh Latimer, and Bishop Nicholas Ridley, all burned at Oxford between 1555 and 1556. The farmer's wife in this reading is Mary herself. What happened at Oxford is among the most thoroughly documented executions in Tudor history. Latimer and Ridley were burned together on a single day in October 1555. They stood back to back at the stake, fastened by a chain, outside the north wall of the town near Balliol College. As the flames were prepared, Latimer reportedly spoke to Ridley words that became one of the most famous final statements in the English language. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Latimer, who was about 70 years old, died relatively quickly. Ridley was not so fortunate. Contemporary accounts suggest the fire burned unevenly, and his suffering was prolonged. The line attributed to Latimer appeared in later editions of Fox's Book of Martyrs, a work first published in 1563 that contained detailed woodcut illustrations of Protestant burnings, and became one of the most widely owned books in English households for over a century. It was chained to church lecterns alongside the Bible itself. It was, arguably, the first mass-produced horror publication in the English language. Its illustrations showed bodies inside flames, executioners with torches, crowds gathered to watch. And it made Bloody Mary's reputation permanent across generations that never saw a single flame. The book went through multiple expanded editions during the 16th century, growing from roughly 1,800 pages to over 2,300, with the number of woodcuts more than doubling. Each edition deepened the archive of Protestant suffering and made the Tudor persecutions harder to forget. Cranmer's execution came 5 months later, in March 1556, and it contained a reversal that no propagandist could have scripted. Under sustained pressure, Cranmer had signed multiple recantations of his Protestant faith. Written surrenders meant to humiliate the man who had built the theological architecture of the English Reformation under Henry VIII and Edward VI. At the site of his burning, Cranmer was expected to read his final recantation aloud as a public spectacle of Catholic triumph. Instead, he repudiated every word he had signed, and then, as the fire rose around him, he thrust the hand that had written the recantations into the flames first. "This unworthy hand," he reportedly declared. He chose which part of his body would burn before the rest followed. A nursery rhyme about blind mice and a carving knife may carry the memory of a man who executed his own hand for its betrayal before the fire took the rest of him. Today, a cross is set into the cobblestones of Broad Street in Oxford, marking the approximate location where all three men were burned. Workmen installing drainage in the 19th century reportedly found fragments of a stake and charred bone at the spot. The Martyrs' Memorial stands nearby, erected in the 1840s. Shoppers, students and tourists walk directly over the cross every day. Most of them do not look down. The Tudor dynasty generated enough royal horror for an entire catalogue of nursery rhymes. But the Stuarts, who followed them, matched the Tudors verse for verse. And the rhyme most commonly associated with the early Stuart court is built around a name that sounds almost too perfect to be real. Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie Porgy ran away. The identification is disputed, and some scholars have proposed Charles II, but one of the most frequently argued candidates is George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham, the personal favourite of King James I. Villiers rose from minor Leicestershire gentry to become the most powerful non-royal figure in England in under a decade. He was made cupbearer in 1614, Gentleman of the Bedchamber the following year, and by 1623 had accumulated the titles of Baron, Viscount, Earl, Marquess, and finally Duke of Buckingham. His ascent was not primarily military. It was not administrative. It was personal. James I governed access to royal power through the bedchamber, a space that was as much a political instrument as a private room, and Villiers controlled access to the bedchamber. That meant he controlled access to the king. A restoration of the royal residence at Apethorpe Hall in the 2000s revealed a previously unknown passage linking the king's bedchamber with that of Villiers. A physical corridor of proximity hidden inside the architecture of the building for 4 centuries. The surviving correspondence between James and Villiers is among the most intimate royal favourite material in English history. James addressed Villiers as Steenie, a pet name derived from St. Stephen, whose face was said to resemble an angel's. In one letter, the king called him "my sweet child and wife." In another, he signed himself "your dear dad and husband." Villiers wrote back, "I naturally so love your person and adore all your other parts, which are more than ever one man had." The same monarch who commissioned the King James Bible, the foundational sacred text of the English-speaking world for 400 years, wrote to his male favourite in the language of marriage and physical affection. The Bible and the love letters were produced by the same court, funded by the same treasury, shaped by the same political relationships. Villiers accumulated titles, estates, patronage appointments, and political leverage at a velocity that generated resentment across Parliament, the military, the aristocracy, and eventually the public. He brokered marriages, influenced diplomatic missions, and helped direct military campaigns, several of which failed disastrously, including the Cadiz expedition of 1625 and the Ile de Ré campaign of 1627, which cost thousands of English lives. His power rested entirely on proximity to the monarch, and when James died in 1625, Villiers attempted to transfer that proximity to the new king, Charles I. Without the personal bond, the arrangement was fragile. Parliament attempted to impeach him. Charles dissolved Parliament to protect him. The accumulated anger from the military, Parliament and the public had nowhere left to go but toward Villiers himself. On the 23rd of August 1628, a former army officer named John Felton walked into a crowded room in Portsmouth and drove a knife into Villiers' chest. The weapon was a tenpenny knife, purchased from a cutler's shop on Tower Hill. Villiers was 35 years old, 5 days short of his 36th birthday. The most powerful royal favourite in England was killed with a blade that cost almost nothing. Charles I reportedly wept at the news. London did not weep. Crowds in the city cheered Felton as a national hero. Popular ballads and poems celebrating the assassination circulated openly. The public that the rhyme says ran away when Georgie came out to play actually celebrated his murder in the streets. Felton was hanged at Tyburn on the 29th of November, and his body was carried to Portsmouth and hung in chains. A public display meant to deter, but one that many treated as a sight of veneration rather than shame. The letters between James and Villiers survive in archives. The tenpenny knife does not. The Stuart court produced one more nursery rhyme, and this one may encode the most consequential political LIE in British history. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. And down will come baby, cradle and all. One widely argued interpretation, though not the only one, connects this lullaby to a specific infant. James Francis Edward Stuart, born on the 10th of June 1688 to Mary of Modena, Queen Consort of James II. The birth should have been a dynastic triumph. A Catholic male heir would secure the Stuart succession and cement the Catholic restoration that James II was attempting across England. Instead, the birth detonated a constitutional crisis that ended the Stuart line's hold on the throne. The Queen's pregnancy was itself a shock. 5 years had passed since her last pregnancy, and none of her previous children had survived infancy. When the birth was formally announced, Protestant England greeted the news not with celebration but with suspicion. Mary of Modena, a devout Catholic, had reportedly declined to submit to several of the customary inspections expected of pregnant queens, making her body, her bedsheets, and her breasts available for examination. That refusal gave her enemies the opening they needed. Within weeks of the delivery, pamphlets flooded London with an extraordinary accusation. The baby, they claimed, was not real. A substitute infant had been smuggled into the Queen's birthing chamber, hidden inside a warming pan, a long-handled metal container used to heat bedsheets. The accusation was almost certainly false, politically motivated by Protestant opponents who could not tolerate a Catholic heir, and devastatingly effective. The Privy Council convened a formal investigation. Around 70 witnesses were called to testify that the birth was genuine. Doctors, courtiers, attendants, midwives, and officials who had been physically present in the room. James II published their depositions formally. It made no difference. Critics printed versions of the testimony with asterisks next to the names of Catholic witnesses, implying bias. The conspiracy theory was more powerful than 70 eyewitnesses standing in the same chamber. The warming pan accusation gave William of Orange the justification he needed. In November 1688, William invaded England. James II fled, sending his infant son ahead to France. The The Glorious Revolution installed a Protestant monarchy that, through an unbroken chain of succession, still occupies the British throne today. The baby, James Francis Edward Stuart, grew up in exile in France and later Italy, known for decades as the Old Pretender. The centre of Jacobite claims that produced 2 major rebellions and decades of political intrigue. He never ruled. The warming pan was never found, because it never existed. A bedtime lullaby about a baby falling from a treetop may be the softest, gentlest preservation of the single most successful act of political disinformation in British history. Parents sing it every night. The dynasty it helped install still reigns. Roughly 40 years before the warming pan lie, England had ripped itself apart in civil war. And that war produced what became the most famous egg in English literature, except the rhyme never mentions an egg. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Not once in the text does the word EGG appear. That image was imposed by centuries of illustration, so thoroughly that most people cannot picture Humpty Dumpty as anything else. One of the most commonly argued origins, promoted as local tradition in Colchester, though treated with skepticism by some folklorists including the Opis, connects Humpty Dumpty to a large royalist cannon deployed during the siege of Colchester in 1648. The siege lasted approximately 11 weeks, from June through August. Royalist forces defending the town reportedly positioned a heavy cannon, nicknamed Humpty Dumpty, on the wall of St. Mary's at the Wall Church. Parliamentary artillery targeted the position. The wall collapsed. The cannon fell into the marshland below and could not be recovered or repaired. All the king's horses and all the king's men could not put it together again. The cheerful rhythm of the nursery rhyme obscures what was, in reality, a humanitarian catastrophe. Civilians inside the besieged town starved. Horses were slaughtered for food. When Colchester finally surrendered, the parliamentary commanders did something unusual even by the bitter standards of the English Civil War. They summarily executed 2 senior royalist officers, Sir Charles Lucas and Sir George Lisle, by firing squad in the castle grounds on the same day as the surrender. There was no formal court-martial. Lucas faced the firing squad first and reportedly opened his shirt, telling the soldiers to do their worst. Contemporary accounts record that Lisle then kissed the body of his dead comrade, turned to the firing party and invited them to step closer. One of the soldiers said they would not miss. Lisle smiled and replied that he had been nearer to them many times before, and they had missed him then. Years later, after the restoration of the monarchy, the men who ordered those executions faced legal consequences of their own. A memorial stone placed by the Lucas family described the killings as having been committed in cold blood, a phrase that echoed across decades of royalist memory. The cannon remained in the mud. The rhyme kept it alive. Colchester Castle is now a museum. The siege features in its exhibitions. Humpty Dumpty does not appear prominently anywhere in the displays. The nursery rhyme and the military history occupy entirely separate registers in the public memory, even though they may describe exactly the same event. There is one final rhyme, and it is the darkest, not because it hides its meaning behind metaphor, but because it does not bother to hide anything at all. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 5 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. When will that be, say the bells of Stepney. I do not know, say the great bells of Bow. Here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head. Every church named in the rhyme is a real building in London. St Clement Danes stands on the Strand. St Martin's is near Trafalgar Square. St Sepulchre's sits beside the Old Bailey Courthouse. Historically, the bell of St Sepulchre's was rung on execution mornings to mark the passage of the condemned. St Mary le Bow anchors Cheapside, its bells defining who is and is not a true Cockney. The churches in Stepney and Shoreditch still serve their parishes. Their bells still ring. The rhyme traces a route through the city, and the route ends at execution. The candle to light you to bed has been interpreted as a reference to the chaplain's candle carried into the condemned prisoner's cell on the final night before the scaffold. The chopper requires no interpretation at all. Tower Green, inside the walls of the Tower of London, served as the site of private executions reserved for prisoners of high enough rank to die away from the public spectacle on Tower Hill. Only 10 people were executed on or near the green itself, including 2 of Henry VIII's wives. The scaffold site is now a perfectly manicured lawn. A glass memorial by the artist Brian Catling, installed in 2006, marks the approximate location where the block once stood. It consists of 2 engraved glass circles bearing the names of those executed, with a sculpted glass pillow at the centre, as if a head had just been resting there. Tourists sit on nearby benches and eat sandwiches. The Tower gift shop, just steps away, sells illustrated children's editions of oranges and lemons alongside toy crowns and replica swords. The final line, the one that explicitly promises beheading, is printed on the page in bright, friendly typography. It is the only nursery rhyme in the English language that does not encode or disguise its violence. It simply announces it. And it is still sung to children who have no idea what a chopper once meant on that ground. Here is where the story shifts. Because many of these connections, the pie, the garden, the mice, Georgie Porgy, the warming pan, the cannon, are not established facts. They are folk etymologies. Popular interpretations mapped onto royal history decades or centuries after the rhymes first appeared, often without contemporary evidence linking composition to event. Iona and Peter Opie, the foremost nursery rhyme scholars of the 20th century, treated several of these royal origin claims with skepticism bordering on dismissal. They argued that many rhymes had simpler, less dramatic origins. Counting games, marketplace chants, nonsense verses with no political subtext at all. The earliest lyrics of Three Blind Mice, published in 1609, do not even mention cutting off tails. The original version of the rhyme and the version children sing today are substantially different texts, separated by over 2 centuries of oral transmission and editorial revision. That skepticism is fair. It is also, in a way, the strongest argument the documentary makes. Because whether or not Mary, Mary, quite contrary was deliberately composed as a coded reference to Bloody Mary, the documented fact remains that Mary I burned approximately 280 people at the stake across a reign of barely 5 years. Whether or not Three Blind Mice was written specifically about Cranmer, Ridley and Latimer, those 3 men were burned alive at Oxford, and Cranmer thrust his own writing hand into the fire before the flames consumed the rest. Whether or not a man named Horner literally intercepted a deed inside a pie, Glastonbury Abbey was dissolved. Its elderly abbot was butchered on a hilltop, and a family named Horner ended up with the property. Whether or not a warming pan was ever intended as a metaphor, 70 witnesses testified to a royal birth that the public flatly refused to believe. And the resulting conspiracy theory helped overthrow a king and install the dynasty that currently sits on the British throne. The rhymes may not be codes, but the history that generation after generation has mapped them onto is entirely, verifiably documented real. And the fact that ordinary people kept reaching for these little songs and saying, "This must be about something terrible the Crown did," tells you what the public remembered and what the Crown wanted them to forget. Mells Manor still stands in Somerset. The original title deed, bearing the King's seal, reportedly remains in the family's possession. The Horner family tomb sits in the parish church. Glastonbury Tor rises above the abbey ruins, and visitors climb it for photographs without knowing what was done to an old man and 2 of his monks at the summit. Smithfield has no major public memorial to the Marian burnings. The cobblestone cross on Broad Street in Oxford is stepped on every single day by people who never look down. The churches named in oranges and lemons still hold regular services. St Clement Danes hosts an annual ceremony held since 1920, where schoolchildren receive oranges and lemons while the melody plays through the nave. The Tower of London sells nearly 3 million tickets a year. The scaffold lawn is one of the most photographed patches of grass inside the walls. Colchester Castle runs a museum. The warming pan was never found because it was never real, but the lullaby it may have inspired is sung in nurseries across the English-speaking world every night by parents who have no idea they might be rocking their children to sleep with the founding lie of the modern British state. The rhymes explain none of this. They do not need to. They are short enough to memorize, simple enough to sing, and old enough that no one alive remembers being taught them. They simply arrived the way all nursery rhymes do, passed from one voice to the next, parent to child, generation to generation, carrying 5 centuries of royal fire. Conspiracy, execution, siege, and political fraud inside melodies too innocent to question. The bells of St Clement's still ring. The bells of St Martin's still ring. The bells of Old Bailey and Bow and Stepney and Shoreditch still ring. And somewhere in London right now, in a primary school within walking distance of the tower, a child is singing the last line. The child does not know what a chopper is. The child does not know about the scaffold lawn, or the glass memorial, or the gift shop, or the 5 centuries of royal terror that produced the melody. The bells know. They have been ringing the whole time.